You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us.
Hi, I'm Johanna from Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast. The podcast that is usually hosted by two women, but as you can hear, you will have to make do with me this week and probably next week because Annie is having family over from England and there was just no time to record in advance because, as you know, just before that, my husband was home for 10 days. I promise things will slow down again once September comes to an end. Speaking about that, I want to remind you that Spooky Fuckery Month is approaching with huge steps, and like every year we would love to hear your listener stories for our annual Halloween special. This year we have a little goodie for you. There will be a giveaway. If you send us your listener story to freshhellpodcast@gmail.com, you have the chance to win a little Austrian sweets package. Everyone who sends us their story until the 20th of October will be thrown into a virtual pot and the winner will be chosen. This is open for all of our listeners who have a paranormal or mysterious true story for us. There will also be a second giveaway for our patrons, so keep your eyes out for the post about that. Speaking about Patreon, I would love to give a huge shout out to our newest Patreon members, and they are Kyle Manley, Emily Hubbard, and Max Jones. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much to all of our patrons and all of our listeners who support us. We wouldn't still be doing this without you. If you want to know more, please listen until the end because that's when I'll tell you all about the logistics of our little podcast over here. Because now it's time to dive into today's case. It's an Austrian case, another Austrian serial killer, another female serial killer from Austria. We covered a few of those already, Mata Marek, for example. And it's a case one of my friends asked me to talk about years ago when we started the podcast. And I figured this is a good time. So today I want to tell you about our own Austrian Black Widow, Elfriede Blauensteiner. And it's a case I remember vividly from the media coverage back in the 90s. This will be a two-part episode. And my biggest source was the book Die Schwarze Witwe von Wien by Monica Butler, as well as contemporary media coverage and documentaries. And as always, I will list everything in my sources. What we know about Elfriede Blauensteiner's childhood and upbringing is from her own memoirs. And I will get into that a little bit later, probably in part 2. So we have to take all of this with a grain of salt. She was born on 22nd of January 1931 as Elfriede Marta Zelinka, as the seventh of a total of 11 children. The family lived in a crowded apartment in Favoriten, which is the 10th district in Vienna, back then and to this day considered more of a working class district. Vienna at the time was no longer the glittering capital of a vast empire. Instead, it had become the center of a much smaller, humbler Austria, still finding its place after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria was in the middle of a shaky democratic experiment known as the First Austrian Republic. And honestly, it wasn't going great. The political climate was rife with tension between left-wing socialists and the right-wing conservatives. When I say tension, I don't mean a few angry pamphlets or heated debates in the coffee houses. No, this was the kind of tension that led to armed street clashes between paramilitary groups. Like most of the world, Vienna was caught in the economic downturn that followed the stock market crash of 1929. Unemployment was high, and inflation had been a constant headache for years after World War I. People weren't just worried about money, they were desperately trying to hold on to whatever they had left. Poverty was widespread, and for many, even the basics were hard to come by. But this brings us to one of the more fascinating aspects of Vienna at the time, Red Vienna. Despite the grim economic reality, Vienna's socialist leadership had an ambitious vision. Under the Social Democratic Workers' Party, the city launched progressive social programs aimed at improving living conditions for the working class. So, social housing projects like the famous Karl-Marx-Hof were built to house thousands in need. And these weren't your average working class slums. They were modern, well-designed spaces intended to give dignity to working-class families. So Vienna was trying something new, experimenting with progressive ideas to lift its citizens out of despair. It was a bold move, especially in the midst of global economic turmoil. Let's look at the cultural scene, because despite everything, despite the political fights, despite the economic depression, Vienna after World War I was still a hub of intellectual and artistic life. The arts didn't vanish just because the empire did. This was still the Vienna of Sigmund Freud, who by 1931 had firmly established psychoanalysis. It was the Vienna of composers like Arnold Schönberg, who was busy reinventing music with his 12-tone technique. And, of course, I mentioned it before, Vienna's coffeehouse culture, it was still thriving. These cafes weren't just places to grab a quick coffee. They were places where intellectuals, writers, and thinkers gathered and discussed ideas and reshaped culture. You could say Vienna was depressed economically, but its mind was still very sharp and very active. But I don't want to romanticize it too much, because while the intellectuals were debating over coffee and while Freud was exploring the human psyche, life for the average citizen was extremely hard. The working class still lived in cramped tenements, and the scars of World War I were still fresh. Unemployment, food scarcity, and housing shortages were part of daily life. And yes, social housing programs were a beacon of hope, but they weren't a quick fix for everyone. It took time to build. Vienna also had a very complex social structure. There was a sharp divide between the working class and the wealthy elite. Not very different from today. And then there was the psychological backdrop. World War I had ended more than a decade earlier, but its aftershocks were still deeply felt. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been a major world power, and its collapse left Austria, and particularly Vienna, grappling with an identity crisis. Once the heart of a grand empire, Vienna was now the capital of a small, struggling republic. The glory days were gone, replaced by a more somber reality. This was the time and place Elfriede was born into, a working-class family in the middle of the Great Depression, while Europe was just coming out of one devastating war, heading right into another one. She was a sickly child, born with a heart defect that would cause her to faint regularly, and this would only be treated when she was already in her late 40s by receiving a pacemaker. In 1933, her father died. By the way, the death was caused by heart failure, so I wonder if it was something genetic. And we can all imagine how impossible it must have been for a single mother back in those days to take care of your children. It's hard enough today for single parents, let alone back in a time when there was basically no support system. Elfriede's mother met a younger man who became her new life partner. I think the problem was, though, that this man wasn't really interested in becoming a supportive husband and a stepfather to a bunch of children who were ranging from toddlers to teenagers. The relationship continued, and the mother started to withdraw more and more from her children, often leaving the children alone to spend time with her new partner in his home. The older children had to take care of the younger ones. A very difficult situation that undoubtedly caused lots of resentment for the children towards the mother, but more so towards the man. At some point, the mother remarried, and he was now officially the children's stepfather. He would often beat the children, of course, not uncommon at the time. But it must have been pretty severe, because at one point the mother even threatened to divorce him if this didn't stop. Empty threats, because where would she go with so many children, no income, no support anywhere? The family moved several times. Each time they rented a single-room apartment. The children had to sleep on the floor, which was harming the malnourished children's health even further. The children developed a cough, which then infuriated the stepfather because he couldn't sleep with the children making so much noise. He became aggressive towards them, and, the cycle cycles. I want to be clear that I'm no way shaming or judging anyone here for the living conditions. It's just how things were back then. My grandfather had 6 siblings, and they lived in a 2-room apartment. And during summer, the boys would move up to the attic just to give everyone a bit more space. And it's hard to imagine for most people nowadays. I am, of course, however, shaming people treating children like the stepfather and the mother did. Anyway, the stepfather joined the NSDAP, so the Nazi party. They moved to a 2-bedroom apartment. 3 more children were born. The youngest died, not even a year old, from an infection. Apparently, at least according to Elfriede Blauensteiner's memoirs, the parents had refused to see a doctor and thus accepting the possibility of the death of the child, which ultimately happened. A doctor was called to issue a death certificate, and he actually threatened to call the police for failure to render assistance, but he then decided against it. I don't know, probably he was feeling sorry for the family. I really don't know why he didn't go through with it. All in all, it was a hard upbringing, an unhappy childhood with lots of deprivations, hunger, brutality, and disease. And as always, I want to make very clear that I'm not telling you all this to make you feel sad or bad for the villain in this story, but, and we mention it often, I think a lot can be learned when looking at a person's life story as a whole. And again, there are so many wonderful, kind people who have had a hard childhood and never would harm anyone. But others grow hard and cold and become a danger to society. And then 1938, the annexation of Austria into the German Reich. And because the stepfather had been a very early, very loyal member of the party, he and his family were assigned a new apartment. Better and bigger than their old homes, and now they even had a little garden. One by one, the sons were drafted, the oldest one first, of course. Neither the stepfather nor the mother cared that much. They didn't even take them to the train station or give them any other form of farewell. The children seem to have countered this cold and distant behavior by their guardians by growing closer as siblings, basically taking care of each other, as the parents showed no interest in them. Then the stepfather was sent off to fight, and he would not return from the Eastern Front. The last month of the war, when Vienna was being bombarded, the mother and her remaining children fled to the countryside, where it was up to Elfriede and her older sister to find enough food to feed everyone. After the war was over, they returned to Vienna, as did the brothers one by one. They all had survived the war. Yeah, the war had ended, but the real work of survival and rebuilding had only just begun. In the spring of 1945, Vienna was barely recognizable. Years of bombing and raids and fighting had left much of the city in ruins. The infrastructure, roads, bridges, buildings had been devastated. I have to say, though, Vienna hadn't been hit as hard as many other cities. We talked about the horrors Hamburg had to endure, for example, or Dresden is another well-known example. But still, the once grand city that had been the capital of an empire, and more recently the annexed province of Nazi Germany, was reduced to rubble in many places. Vienna had been heavily bombed by Allied forces in 1944 and 1945, with industrial areas, railways, and key infrastructure being prime targets. By the time Soviet forces entered Vienna in April of 1945, the city was in shambles. Around a quarter of the buildings had been destroyed or seriously damaged, and many parts of the city were barely habitable. For the people of Vienna, the end of the war brought a mix of relief and uncertainty. On one hand, of course, there was the end of Nazi rule and the violence of war. On the other hand, there was the question of survival in a city that had been bombed, occupied, and divided. The basic necessities, food, shelter, water, were hard to come by. With infrastructure in ruins, supply lines were disrupted and resources were scarce. The food situation was particularly dire. Rationing had already been part of daily life during the war, but now, with the city's supply chains shattered, it became a struggle just to get enough to eat. People relied heavily on ration cards, but even then, what was available wasn't enough. Bread, potatoes, and whatever could be scavenged became the staples of survival. Malnutrition and hunger were rampant, and the black market trading flourished as desperate people tried to get their hands on whatever food or goods they could find. Many people, including Elfriede and her siblings, would regularly take the train to the countryside to trade goods for food from the local farmers. Also, as I said, Vienna's infrastructure, including its power and water supplies, was severely damaged. Electricity was available intermittently at best, and clean drinking water was hard to come by. Many Viennese had to rely on makeshift wells or water from the Danube, which carried serious health risks. Rebuilding these essential services was slow, and life for many was lived in a state of constant improvisation. In terms of housing, the situation was also grim. Thousands of homes had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Families who had once lived comfortably found themselves crammed into bombed-out shells of buildings or sharing space with others in overcrowded apartments. The lucky ones might have had access to undamaged houses, but even then, the conditions were harsh. No heating, limited light, and little protection from the elements. The oldest brother had returned from the Russian front severely wounded and infected with malaria. The mother didn't even go to the train station to welcome him home, and all the children were forbidden to go and welcome their oldest brother themselves. He returned alive, but his health was deteriorating quickly. Lying in an unheated room, having not enough food while battling a fever, can be deadly. Elfriede took over the care of her oldest brother and nursed him back to health. She was now a young, rather attractive woman, and she had learned to use her looks to her advantage. Again, no judgment here. I will forever remember my grandmother told me that she used to innocently flirt with GIs to get some chocolate or chewing gum. It's how it was. She was looking for employment and she had the chance to go to England to work in a factory there. She then would be able to send home money, but the mother just said no and reinforced that final verdict with a couple of slaps to her face. She had to stay home, and that was that. Elfriede then found employment in a very fancy Konditorei. I'm not sure if you have a 100% equivalent in other countries. I think so, but I best would translate it to cake shop, or pastry shop, or confectionery shop maybe. You can not only buy the delicious cakes and take them home, most of the time you can also sit down and enjoy it right then and there with some coffee or tea. Very similar to a coffee house, especially a Vienna cafe house, but still a bit different because while in a coffee house the coffee is the main attraction and the cakes and pastry are the sideshow, in a Konditorei it's basically the other way around and they are made freshly there in the Konditorei. Anyway, young Elfriede was put in a nice uniform and started to serve cakes and coffee to fancy ladies. And she longed to be a fancy lady herself, observing the way these women behaved, how they talked, how they moved. She studied them to emulate them one day. She worked hard, saved money, moved into a room that she rented from one of the fancy ladies. She bought a set of nice clothes and started to befriend a couple of mostly elderly people from the upper middle class, rich widows and doctors and the like. She met young men and she fell in love for the first time. A man by the name of Alfred, or Freddy for short, was her first great love. But he cheated on her with her own sister, which resulted in a pregnancy and ultimately in a short-lived marriage between Freddy and said sister. After the divorce, Elfriede and Freddy rekindled their relationship and even moved in together. Elfriede worked, she even got promoted, she furnished their home, she tended to their loaded garden, they had friends over, everything was nice and comfy. Then Elfriede gets pregnant and the couple marries, I think in 1953. The child, a daughter, is born on 1st of July 1954. And it was almost a miracle, as doctors had told Elfriede before that she will never get pregnant because of some problems with her ovaries. Then, in 1957, the young family lost their apartment, and I'm not entirely sure was it due to not being able to make rent, or because it was an apartment provided by Freddy's employer, and Freddy had lost his job, I think it was 3 years prior, so I don't really know why now all of a sudden they had to move out. Doesn't really matter. They had no place to go. There were no affordable apartments available to them. So they had to move into some barracks where they shared a small room, all three of them. Then, on top of it all, Elfriede lost her job and now the family's financial situation grew even more dire. Freddy started to go out in the evening, spending his time and the little money they had with other women. He was apparently very charming and good-looking enough. Oftentimes Elfriede would go to bed hungry, her husband still out who knows where. And often neighbors would give her food to help her feed herself and her child. And she started to despise Freddy. Again, I want to emphasize that this is all from Elfriede Blauensteiner's memoirs, used as sources in the books and articles I read. The memoirs are out of print. I didn't read them. As I said, I will talk a little bit more about it later. Anyway, of course, this account will be heavily leaning into Elfriede being the victim of her own circumstances. Yet, so many facts are kind of mysterious to me. For example, why did Elfriede and Freddy both lose several employments and had difficulties finding new jobs? Don't get me wrong, this can have many reasons, but overall the late 50s in Austria and Germany were a time of the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, so the era of economic miracle. Lots of people were needed to rebuild the economy, rebuild buildings, and due to the loss of a whole generation of men, employers were desperate for employees. So I don't know what really happened there. Back to Freddy. He started an affair with a woman 15 years older than him, apparently a rather wealthy one. Elfriede would sometimes see her husband getting in and out of a fancy car. He was gifted a gold watch and a car of his own. After the affair ended, though, he had to return both those things. But this was not the last affair Freddy would have. Others followed. And Elfriede basically decided to turn a blind eye for now. Anyway, more important things happened. way better things. They found a new place to live, a real apartment. A new job followed, but not for long. She lost the job when she was rumored to be a sex worker. Again, in her memoirs, Blauensteiner is certain that all these people talking badly about her were only jealous of her good looks and her pretty face and long legs. I think you can all start to see a picture of how she was thinking and how she was walking through life. Another job was found, and Freddy enjoyed his time being unemployed, sitting at home, drinking. He didn't want to go back to being employed. He dreamed of being his own boss. And of course, this plan didn't come to fruition the way he thought. He grew mean and nasty, especially towards his wife, who was not only out working most of the day, but also pregnant once more with their second child. And during an argument, Freddy hit her belly, which led to a miscarriage. And you'd think that this would have been the moment where she would have had enough and finally divorced this cheating, drinking, no good of a partner. But no, it was not yet. Because first, they moved to a hut in the mountains. Freddy had gotten the offer to rent a hut in the mountains used to accommodate hikers and to become the innkeeper. Elfriede was adamantly against this plan. First of all, they still had debts in the city they needed to pay, but also she knew her husband was neither one to work hard nor one who was responsible with money. And she didn't want to live in such an isolated place with him, not after all that had happened lately. But Freddy threatened divorce if she wouldn't come with him, and so they went and lived on the mountain. And you might have already guessed it, it was bad. Elfriede was working, cleaning, cooking, taking care of their child and taking care of the guests. And Freddy, well, he was pissing away their money, drinking and playing cards and cheating on his wife. He even told her that he would only stop cheating on her if she would perform certain sexual acts, which she refused to do. The situation escalated more and more, with Freddy threatening to kill her and take away the child. Yet, at one point, Freddy severely injured himself chopping firewood. He could have easily died, and he probably would have if his wife wouldn't have saved him. She knew how to take care of the wound and what medicine to give him until the doctor could finally arrive. She knew how to use drugs for good, and later, apparently for bad. In the meantime, Elfriede's mother had died, as well as another sister. The sister had died from heart failure, so I really think it might truly have been something genetic. The remaining siblings didn't keep in touch, which is sad. At one point in life, they all had been so close because they needed to take care of each other, and Elfriede then claimed that she never saw her siblings again after their mother's funeral. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but I think they definitely had drifted apart and became estranged. After 9 years of marriage, Elfriede and Freddy finally separated, but it was not she who wanted the separation, it was him in the end. And they divorced years after the separation in 1967, because it was basically a war of roses. Elfriede rented her own little convenience store, and she found a new hobby: gambling. Every weekend she would go to the casino and play roulette. I need to say that a casino here is a very fancy location. Men need to wear a tie, women wear cocktail attire at least. There are machines, yes, but mostly people go to play roulette and blackjack and baccarat. You drink sparkling wine, it's really nice. It's also nice for people watching, I like it. But of course, just because it looks super fancy, it doesn't mean that it isn't just as addictive. Elfriede loved the fancy atmosphere, of course she did. And so she went there regularly, and in the beginning she really had it under control. She would win and stop playing, taking her winnings home. With the income from her shop and the casino money, she was able to afford a nice apartment and even rent a bigger store. But soon she would lose control over her gambling habit, which is a bit surprising because so far she seemed to have been a person who always wanted to be in control. No drinking, no smoking, taking care of money, always keeping up this composed persona. Gambling seemed to have been her weak spot. Soon she was known at the casino. She came waltzing in wearing a fur coat, being very generous with tips and her winnings, giving money to her fellow gamblers when they had been unlucky that night. According to her memoirs, her highest winning in one evening had been 460,000 shilling, and in euro that would be 33,500. But according to the historical inflation calculator, this would be close to 200,000 euros now, which is inconceivable, and I'm not entirely sure that's true, but if it is, that's a lot of money. It's now the mid-70s, Elfriede's daughter is all grown up and moves out, and in with her new boyfriend. And we will talk next week about how she experienced her upbringing and her own mother, Elfriede Blauensteiner. Elfriede met another man named Rudolf Blauensteiner. And from his last name, you can already guess he was going to be her second husband. Rudolf Blauensteiner had his very own set of relationship baggage. His wife and the mother of his 3 children had cheated on him with his own uncle. He was 34 when he met the 43-year-old Elfriede, but according to Elfriede, she looked way younger. She was very pretty, very handsome, and he looked more to be in his late 40s. If that's true or not, we don't know. Anyway, they started dating, even though she wasn't exactly smitten with the new suitor. He actually wasn't her type at all. She described him as being rather pathetic. But he had one big plus. He was working for the Austrian railway, and back in those days, that meant he was a Beamter. I guess the best translation is civil servant. A Beamter, a civil servant, is someone who works for the government in a formal, often tenured position, typically with very specific legal protections, obligations, but also benefits. This can range from administrative staff, law enforcement officers, judges, and back then, as I said, also railway staff, postal service staff, teachers, and it will become important that Rudolf Blauensteiner was a Beamter, a civil servant. Why was that such a plus? What exactly did it mean to be a Beamter in 1970s Austria? Well, back then, and to a certain extent still to this day, it came with the reputation of stability and security. The most obvious benefit? Job security. If you were a Beamter, you essentially had a job for life. So basically tenure. Once you were fully appointed, your employment was secure and it was nearly impossible to lose your job, unless, of course, you were guilty of something really serious like gross misconduct. But for the vast majority of civil servants, being fired was a very distant concern of them. This kind of job stability was rare, especially in a time when economic ups and downs could leave many private sector employees feeling very vulnerable. Job security was just the beginning though. One of the biggest draws for becoming a Beamter was the pension system. Civil servants didn't just retire, they retired comfortably. Pensions for civil servants were generous, often covering up to 80% of their final salary. To put that in perspective, most private sector workers couldn't dream of such a payout. For a Beamter, their years of service translated into a guaranteed financial cushion for the rest of their lives. So not only did they have job security during their working years, but they also knew they were set for retirement. Of course, retirement wasn't the only thing these jobs had going for them. Civil servants had access to comprehensive health insurance that often covered not only them, but their families as well. And this wasn't just basic coverage, it was high-quality healthcare, more extensive than what many private sector workers could even access. For a family, that meant fewer worries about medical bills and better access to care when it was needed. Then there were the salary structures. While civil servants didn't always start with the highest salaries, they definitely benefited from a system of incremental pay increases. This meant that every few years, based on seniority and length of service, they would receive automatic raises. It was a steady, predictable way of ensuring financial growth without the anxiety of negotiating pay rises or wondering if the next promotion would ever come. In some cases, the government even provided housing directly. Imagine having the state help you secure a place to live, which is an incredible advantage, especially in cities where housing could be expensive. And there were other benefits like family allowances and special rates for loans. These kind of extras made life as a Beamter noticeable more comfortable. And unlike the private sector, where long and irregular hours could be the norm, being a Beamter often came with the benefit of regular, predictable work schedules. Civil servants usually had clear working hours, and this structure allowed for a better work-life balance. Public holidays and vacation time were well defined, offering a degree of certainty that private sector employees couldn't always count on. And then there was the legal protection. Civil servants had their own set of legal safeguards, making it much harder for them to be dismissed or disciplined without a legitimate cause. This wasn't just about job security, it was about having rights and protections that made her position even more secure. And finally, there was professional development. A career as a Beamter wasn't stagnant. There were clear opportunities for promotion and advancements based on seniority and performance. Training and education were often provided, helping civil servants develop new skills and also move up in their careers. Add to all of this the possibility of favorable tax treatment, And you can start to see why civil service was such an attractive career path here throughout history. And as I said, still is today. So now, to Elfriede, Rudolf Blauensteiner started to look a little bit better immediately. And I think this is the perfect moment to stop for today. This week was all about Blauensteiner's upbringing and background. As I said, take it with a grain of salt. Next week will be all about the murders and the trial. My something good of the week is that we don't have a basement, because it's been raining for 2 days now. It's supposed to be raining, heavy rains until Monday. There are a lot of warnings giving out all over Austria that people should stay home if possible. Strong winds are expected. And I'm very happy that our house is kind of raised up. You have to go up a couple of steps. So we won't be having the worries of being flooded. Yeah, but it looks a little bit bad at the moment, and I'm gonna keep you posted how the weather is gonna be in the next couple of days. We already had snowfall in Austria the last 2 days. Just a couple of days ago, we had 33 degrees Celsius, and now we went to 7 degrees Celsius here. So yesterday was the first time in this season that I had to start a fire in the stove. Which it's also a good thing for me, something good to have a stove that I can, start a fire for a couple of hours and get all nice, warm and cozy. To dry the dogs, because I have to send them out to go pee and poop. And they don't like that in the rain. So anyway, that was my something good for the week. As I said, I'm not sure if Annie is gonna be with us next week already. If not, it's gonna be me telling you the rest of the story. She will definitely be back the week after that. If you enjoyed this episode, or any of our other episodes, please do us a huge favor. Go to your favorite podcast app and leave us a rating and or review. Leave us comments under the Spotify episodes. Thank you, Lisa from Texas, I think. We see you. We read your comments. We love them. Thank you to everybody else who leaves comments. Thank you to everyone who leaves comments under our YouTube videos, who sends us emails. Check out our webpage, freshhellpodcast.com. There you find all the links to our merch store, to our Instagram, to our email, to our PO box. Again, send us your listener stories for Halloween. Everybody will be entering automatically for the giveaway. And join our Facebook group. It's always fun there. Join our Patreon if you want to. Go to patreon.com, search for Fresh Hell. We pop right up. There's going to be 2 live events happening this month. And I'd say that's it. Please be kind to your animals, be kind to your fellow human beings, and the most important part of it all, be kind to yourself. Don't forget, if you're going through hell, keep going. Tschüss.